Our next speaker is Professor Donald Hornstein. He's the Aubrey L. Brooks Professor of Law from UNC School of Law, and he's here to talk to us today about risk regulation. We're honored to have Professor Hornstein with us today. His environmental law scholarship has twice been recognized as among the annual top 10 national articles of the year. His articles on risk regulation in particular have appeared in some of the nation's top law journals. An expert on catastrophic risk insurance coverage, he's been appointed by the state's Commissioner of Insurance to the Board of Directors of North Carolina's Wind Pool, which is a $400 million insurance facility insuring properties against catastrophic wind damage at the coast and along the Outer Banks. We're excited to hear him speak today about a brand new funding source that he's been instrumental in developing, so please join me in welcoming Professor Hornstein. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me just, as long as this is being filmed for forever, I should indicate that mostly I will be talking to you not as an academic, but as an insurer, and in particular as someone who purchases reinsurance and cat bonds, as opposed to someone unlike my two predecessors and the speaker after me who's trying to sell you reinsurance. I am a purchaser of reinsurance, and in particular I want to talk about how we at the beach plan, as we call it, use this and try to link it to creating on-the-ground resiliency of the assets we insure, as opposed to simply after-the-fact financial resiliency of money we would get after some disaster. Having said that, the most important thing on the screen behind me, since I am a lawyer, is the asterisk that I want you to note, especially as this is being filmed, which is I am happy to talk candidly to you about what I've learned firsthand working as an insurer, and yet I just want to be clear, everything I say, I am not speaking for the NCIUA. I'm not even speaking for the role I would play as a member of the board on the NCIUA. That said, I have been given over the last 10 years this window into how insurance works on the ground and how it can be linked to resiliency. Let me start by talking about something you hear all the time, and you saw referenced a few times in the two speakers before me by Mike and Sam, which is that since insurance seems to be paying for a fair amount of the losses, more about that in a moment, to what extent might we, as Sam said, be able to bank insurance savings that might, in fact, be brought about by on-the-ground improvements on resiliency now? In other words, if we pay now to prevent future losses, is there a way to monetize that in particular? The thought that stems from the premise that insurance is, in fact, at the front lines. So the article you see in front of me is one of a zillion articles that make this argument, that insurers, in fact, are on the front lines of weather and catastrophes that are weather-related, whether flood, wind, or in between. It probably makes sense to break this down a little bit. The first thing is what we mean by resiliency. There's two standard ways, of course. One is, and this is the way insurance classically gets involved, is after the bad event. Money comes in to help you bounce back. That's the standard approach to resiliency, is how resilient are you in your ability, say as a municipality, a county, or an entity, to bounce back to where you were. The other dimension of resiliency, of course, is going into these events. How well prepared are you to withstand them, to not suffer those losses, or at least to mitigate those losses? And I am interested in particular on the second of those. To what extent can insurance actually be linked to financing improvements on the ground that prevent the losses from happening in the first place, what Sam called banking on future insurance savings? That said, however, since you have had two people from the insurance company, and Mike and Sam talked to you before, I thought I would just test your insurance IQ. Help me fill in these lines. Nationwide is what? Oh, good. And like a good neighbor, who's there? Good. All this tells me is that you watch TV. These are both lies. That's probably, it's probably a little harsh to say that, but not entirely. Since the 1960s, as Mike pointed out, all primary insurers have withdrawn, at least on the homeowner's side, from flood. You'll see this flood exclusion in your homeowner's policy, relegating flood insurance to the NFIP, except for a few insurers starting just barely coming back into the market at the margins. But honestly, forget the margins. Insurers are absent when it comes to flood on the ground, largely. As to wind, until recently, insurers in the 21st century were doing what insurers had done 50 years ago, which is largely exiting the field. I don't need to tell you this, but Nationwide, for example, dropped thousands of policies in Virginia, as well as several other southeastern states in the aftermath of storms. This is just on the wind side, that a company like Nationwide would come in and give notice. Of course, it has to give notice that it's not going to renew some months ahead. But one of the ways it dealt with risk was to just cut and run. You see a lot of the major insurers do the same too. And you saw a lot of this take place. The reason I got into this field is that in 2008, Farmers Insurance actually gave notice to the state of North Carolina. They were going to leave the state entirely, rather than participate, as I'll explain, in coastal wind insurance, which it viewed, probably correctly, as such a threat to their bottom line that they couldn't even afford to sell insurance anywhere in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem or Asheville or Charlotte. They were going to leave the entire state rather than participate in coastal losses. For eventualities like that, most southeastern and Gulf states create a different type of insurance company, and that's the insurance company I'm a member of the board of. These are called residual insurers. I'll talk to you more about them in a moment, but one good indicator of how much major insurers or private insurers have left the field is to see the growth in written policies by entities like us. About a 1,500% growth in policies of homeowners who could not find insurance in the private market and had to drift toward these nonprofit or government residual programs such as mine. Virginia, from what I can tell, has not been hit as hard by this as North Carolina was. There are some major insurers that do provide coverage. On the other hand, I have checked just a little bit about what Virginia wind coverage looks like in your state in the last 10 years. And generally speaking, of course, the private insurers will stay here, but at a price. The premiums have gone up, often doubled, and usually you're buying less for more. You're getting relatively hollowed out coverage, meaning that there'll be a deductible, like a windstorm deductible. Instead of 1%, it's 2%, or even 5%. Which means like the first $10,000 or $15,000 of loss are on you before you even begin to be able to give bills to your insurer. That said, because this was the case, certainly nationwide, what you saw in the United States as to natural catastrophe losses is what you'll see everywhere. This is a worldwide slide. It's famous in insurance circles. And it actually shows how much we need insurance to be engaged. First of all, notice this is worldwide. I'll also tell you this is all cats, so it includes non-weather cats, things like earthquakes. That said, the biggest cat loss worldwide, as in this country, is flooding, by far, order of magnitude. The interesting thing about this slide is you don't have to be a rocket scientist to read it left to right, just to see year by year the average number of losses measured in the tens and tens of billions of dollars is rising over time. And the blue bar graphs are the amount of insurance penetration, how much of these losses are covered by insurance of any kind. It could be primary insurance, reinsurance, any kind of insurance. The big thing to appreciate is even though, as Sam said, 2018 was a historic year, and it followed 2017 in terms of insurance losses to the insurance industry, insurance worldwide only is on the front lines. About 30% of all losses are insured. The rest falls on government. And that's a huge problem worldwide. If you're a developing country, you have no hope of meeting the UN's Sustainable Development Goals over the next 50 years if your economy and your municipal budgets, your city, your country budgets are knocked flat backwards every time one of these storms come in, and you spend the money that you need for everything else just on storm recovery. I mean, you need insurance. We need insurance to be there as a buffer between the people and their governments that bear the costs of these risks and these mounting costs themselves. So the takeaway from this is, on the one hand, insurers don't seem to be on the front lines as much as you'd think. They're doing as much as they can, but for a number of reasons, they're not there because they can't make money at it. And there's a variety of reasons why they don't make money at it, but the bottom line is they're engaged, but they're not super engaged. I'm going to come back to this because I knew that Mike and Sam would talk about some of these new insurance things, and I do want to come back, but I don't need to repeat what they said, although I'll give you a little bit of a gloss on my take of them from the point of view, like you, as a prospective buyer of reinsurance products with an eye toward resiliency. Let me make this just a little bit less abstract. I want to just talk to you about the entity on which I'm a part. It's called the North Carolina Insurance Underwriting Association. We cover two parts of the state. We cover the Outer Banks and Barrier Islands, which are in red, and then we cover the other 18 coastal counties. We are by far the largest single insurer of homeowners and property in North Carolina. We insure 75% of all property on the Outer Banks, and we insure about 40% of all other property in the blue counties that are there. We are there. What I want you to appreciate is we're just an insurance company. I say we. This is where our offices look like. There's nothing abstract about it. This actually is in Cary, North Carolina. We're located in Cary, which is near Raleigh. So in case the coast is taken out by a storm, we can continue to settle claims. We, of course, have, in case Cary is taken out, we have mirror sites set up. I think one's in Las Vegas and one's in San Francisco. So if the entire East Coast is taken out, we can still settle claims. The other interesting thing I can tell you, we actually have moved from this building a month ago for various reasons. One of the reasons is our building was bought by Epic Games. Only a few of you are smiling. You obviously have teenagers. If the rest of you don't know what Epic Games is, your children do. I guarantee it. They are the company that actually makes Fortnite, which is, like I said, if you don't know what it is or you've heard about it, your kids know what it is. We're a $400 million a year insurance company. These kids that run Epic, that show up to work every morning at 10 with their pink hair and their flip-flops, they make $400 million a month. Epic Games. They give their product away for nothing. So welcome to the modern world. I want you to appreciate us financially. This is where I actually will show you from our point of view how we interact with companies like Mike's and through brokers like Sam's. Let me tell you something about the way we are structured. We are structured as a 501c6 nonprofit. All that means is that if we have money left over, as we do most years, it goes right, do you see this bottom gray tranche at the bottom? It doesn't go out to anybody. We save it. Basically save for a windy day is what we're allowed to do. We're allowed to do that. I can tell you that is no small accomplishment. If we were a private insurance company, this was from 2016, we were sitting on $1.1 billion in cash. We went into Florence, by the way, last year with almost $2 billion in cash. If we were a private insurance company sitting on between $1 and $2 billion in cash, we would be a takeover target. Let me rephrase that. We would be taken over by people wanting to get at the cash. And with apologies to those of you at state government, if we were a state government entity sitting on $2 billion in cash, the government would find a way to get it from us. The beauty in this case as a 501c6 is that we are neither, and yet we have a revenue ruling from the IRS that says we can save this money tax-free. We are a nonprofit. So we save money in the bottom tranche in the event of a storm, and I'll also tell you we pay losses from the bottom up. Let me just show you how we approach every year just in terms of catastrophic losses. First of all, I don't know if you can see at the top, do you see the 100-year thing I'm circling? We want to make sure we go into every storm year. So May 1st began the 2019 storm year for us with enough financial resources to cover a 1 in 100-year event or 1 in 100-year year. That's a combination of how ferocious the winds will be and what they hit in terms of the losses. So in 2016, that was $3.5 billion. So we needed to go into that year with $3.5 billion in financial assets so we could immediately pay our policyholders. So we went into that year, we had $1.1 billion in cash. We always keep $200 million safe just to keep the place going. So we had $800 million that we would immediately use there before we get to the light blue tranche. You see that light blue tranche? It says member company assessments. In North Carolina, as in many states, for insurers that don't want to write high risks, whether it is coastal risks or it's high-risk medical pools or anything else, all states have mechanisms to force insurers back into the picture, not to let them cherry-pick the risks that they want to write. So you sort of have to take the bitter with the sweet, is the philosophy behind these laws. Somehow they're constitutional in this country, and because that's the case, every insurer in North Carolina, whether they write at the coast or not, is going to share in losses at the coast in that light blue tranche up to $1 billion. And they do that based on what their percentage is throughout the rest of the state. So if Allstate doesn't write at all at the coast, but they sell 10% of all property policies everywhere else in North Carolina, in Charlotte and Winston and so on. After a big storm like this, we would send Allstate we send them a letter, and it says, I'm sorry, but you owe us 10%, that's your share, of $1 billion in losses, that's $100 million, and we put a stamp on it. They have to give it to us within a week, or they go to prison. So that's where we get the next billion of dollars. And if they don't like it, they can leave our little state. And that's what farmers threatened to do in 2008. I will tell you that at that point, our entity was structured, I'm sorry to say, a little bit like your FAIR plan is here in Virginia, which is a little different than this. Here in Virginia, your FAIR plan has insurers both participating collectively with losses, but also in good years participating in profits, like taking money out. The problem was in North Carolina, you were on the hook for unlimited losses prior to 2008. Farmers said, it wasn't a light blue, $1 billion. It would be light blue all the way through the roof up to infinity. If $1 trillion storm came in, you'd be on the hook for 10% of $1 trillion. So farmers said, we're leaving. And that's where I got roped into all of this. I was just sitting in my office at UNC when I got a call from the Speaker of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the President of the Senate. They needed to create an emergency study commission to fix this law because insurers were going to leave our state rather than participate in these losses. So I played a role in actually writing the law, the new law that was enacted and signed into law in 2009 that created this structure that let us go to the blue tranche but limited insurers to $1 billion in order to keep them here, but it's $1 billion and relatively low down the paying structure. And then, no good deed. I was appointed by the Commissioner of Insurance to this board that I had designed so that if it didn't work, I could suffer. The tan tranches that are above this are us going up to the next $1.5 billion of coverage with companies like Mike's. These tranches are all reinsurance. This is us going, and in this case, this is very traditional reinsurance, just to give you an example. So these are not parametric triggers. These are not triggered by outward events like wind speed or tide rises. These are very traditional, what they're called excess of loss coverage, which means that if the losses go above $2.1 billion, you can see this 100% of this amount of money excess, that means in excess of $2.1 billion, this company is on the hook for the next $378 million. We actually require them to put the money in a box somewhere so that they can't cheat us. That's how we handle the credit risk that our reinsurers would somehow go broke. We ensure the money is there, and it's there for the year or the term of the contract. And we pay them an amount. I don't know what this amount was, but it might have been like $12 or $13 million we'll give them. At the end of a year, if that's not triggered, they keep the $12 or $13 million. Honestly, it's a sweet deal for them. I mean, it works out both ways. There's something called the probability of non-exceedance, which is this funny little number over here. This is how the reinsurers play sort of a lottery in reverse. When we play a lottery, we have like a 1 in a zillion chance of winning, like nothing. You're just going to lose whatever you put down. You're not going to get the payout. The probability of non-exceedance from the point of view of reinsurers is what is the likelihood that this threshold will not be crossed? So they're playing this game in which there's a 97, almost 98% chance that they're going to win. Now, to be fair, they're on the hook, and we all care about those 2%. But that's why capital is willing to form reinsurance companies, or as we'll talk about in a moment, cat bonds, and participate in this. And companies like ours are happy to pay the $10 or $12 million. I mean, the alternative is for us to actually have $378 million on hand, which we could if we doubled or tripled the rates for insurance for everyone at the coast. This is actually a more efficient way of doing it by just externalizing this to the worldwide reinsurance market, which of course can lay off risks to North Carolina, with risks to China, with risks to France, you know, wherever they geographically diversify their risk. So that's how the economics of it work. And then we negotiate usually every year with these various reinsurance companies. We do so with a broker. Sadly, Sam, we don't use you, but I know you want us to. And we'll think about it, because Willis is excellent. We have a company called Guy Carpenter, which is a company, not a person. And Guy Carpenter is our broker that helps us with our reinsurance program. I will tell you, well, I should just show you, everyone's talked about reinsurance. It's probably good you see it. There's nothing magical about it. I'm on the reinsurance committee. When we want to buy those tranches, we'll go around the world to buy them. So this actually, I don't know if you know the London financial skyline, but you see the funny thing that looks like a pickle. That's the Gherkin building. That's the Swiss Re building, as in Swiss reinsurance. The big thing that looks like a cheese grater is nicknamed the cheese grater. That's the Leadenhall building. That's a big reinsurer. And down here at the bottom, with these weird blue scaffolding on it, that's Lloyd's of London. That is the actual and spiritual home of all insurance in the world. You're not allowed to go in, but here I'm taking you in. This is what we go in when you're going to do business, and we will go up to a reinsurer desk. In this case, it's Ascot. Sorry, Mike, but we are buying a tranche of reinsurance from them. And we will do that. We'll fly to Bermuda, and we'll go to Germany, and we'll buy these tranches to fill out all those tan tranches. By the way, if we don't like the price of the reinsurer set, as Sam has pointed out, one of the nicest innovations in the last 10 years are these catastrophe bonds. Catastrophe bonds are sort of like reinsurance in a box. It's just a bunch of investors. As Mike said, there are trillions of dollars in the capital markets. And some of those investors like to diversify into a product, also as Mike said, that is not correlated with the stock market. So the stock market could crash, and instead of dragging down whatever they're invested in, they're invested in weather, and they're just not connected. You could have a bad storm year at the same time the stock market goes up, and vice versa. So cat bonds, if we don't like the prices that reinsurers get us, we will go with our broker to the cat bond market, and we will get a better rate. And one of those tranches will be filled with a cat bond. This year, for example, as of 31 days ago, Cape Lookout Re is a $450 million cat bond that we purchased that went active April 1st that will carry us over for the next 2 or 3 years. 4 years ago, Tar Heel Re was the largest cat bond in the world that was weather-related that we purchased. We were the first program of our type to actually do reinsurance. And between you and me, every time I go to the Outer Banks, I catch hell for it. Everybody comes up to me and says, "You're just giving our money away to these international bankers." And I say, well, and I explain to them how this works in their benefit. I said, the alternative is to raise your rates 5,000 times. And they say, how often have you ever actually received money from them back? And honestly, until Florence, we had never triggered a cat bond tranche. And I say that, and they just, throw up their hands and say, well, what a waste. You have spent $500, $600 million over the last n number of years on reinsurance. And of course, the answer to that is I always ask them if they have term life insurance in case they were to die. And then they say yes. And then I say, well, do you feel cheated that you've never gotten a payout? And then it doesn't matter. They still hate it. So this is what it looks like. We go into every year with this amount of financing. So the question I had is, and the gray tranches, a few years ago, we spent almost $200 million a year on reinsurance. 2 years ago, because our gray tranche had grown so high, we needed fewer of the tan tranches. I think it was only 25 million, something like that. I mean, our reinsurance budget actually was quite low that year. But I go into all these years and I asked the question, is there a way we could save on reinsurance costs were we to find a way to make our book of business, meaning the homes we insure, more resilient to wind? That was the question that I wanted answered. Could we, as Sam said, bank on savings from increased resiliency now based on insurance savings and reinsurance costs in the future? Were we in a position to actually bring these two things together? That is a question I asked. There is, I have to do something to this, I think. Let me just ask you, you've seen, how many of you know about this entity, IBHS? Oh, good Lord. So let me just say a quick thing about it and then just run the slide. You probably all know, directly or indirectly, how the insurance industry approaches risk, which isn't just underwriting. Through its sister organization, the Insurance Institute for Automobile Safety was established 20, 30 years ago to actually investigate how to make cars safer, because insurers are on the hook for the billions of dollars in losses every year caused by auto accidents. And so they created a laboratory paid for by all insurers in which almost all of the safety devices on our cars, airbags, side airbags, the third brake light, anti-lock brakes, all those things were tested first by the Insurance Institute to make sure they worked, and if so, discounts and so on were made, and pressure was brought by the insurance industry to make cars safer, because then they could make auto insurance more affordable, which was the idea. A few years ago, they created, like 10 years ago, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety to see if they could make buildings safer, following the same thing. So they're actually organized, their headquarters are in Tampa, but they have one of the largest wind tunnels in the world outside of Charlotte. So what they can do is create a hurricane inside. This is a Cat 3 hurricane that's being created without rain, just wind. The interesting thing about these two buildings is they are both built to code, both of them. The house on the left that is being blown off by this wind is to code and brand new. The house on the right had like $3,000, that's it, of little extra hardware anchoring the walls to the bottom and the roof to the walls. And that difference really asks the question, well, why in the world can't the insurance in the industry incentivize people to put on the $2,000 or $3,000 of things like were on one of the buildings on the right in exchange for reduced premiums? That was the idea. So I guess I should back up for a moment before I show you this slide. That was the question I had. Is we actually went down to IBHS to Tampa, and they had all this data, And I had a very bad conversation with them. I met them and I said, well, why is your company such a failure? You have all this data, and as far as I can tell, nobody is putting it on their homes. And to their credit, they said, well, we are a scientific entity. It's up to others to actually get it out into the marketplace. But there was definitely an implementation gap between what we knew we could do to make the world safer from these catastrophic risks and actually getting it done. So, since we were in a position, because we pay for reinsurance, to maybe harvest some of the gains, were we, for example, to take some of our money from the bottom tranche and give it away to make homes safer, to harvest this. So I'm going to show you, actually I'm not legally allowed to show you that until that. So the thing I want to show you is this. We had Guy Carpenter Analytics actually run these data. Do you see that horizontal blue line? It says 51.3 on it. That's $51 million. And a premise was, what if we just gave away $51 million in grants to our homeowners, this was on the Outer Banks, to make their homes safer, to put in, especially their roofs safer. It turns out the roof is the cheapest, most cost-effective way you can insure against most wind losses, is start with the roof. So the question was, what would the effect to us be on giving away $50 million in order to bank on insurance savings later? So, Sam, this was the first resilience bond, as far as I could tell, that was created. It just wasn't a financial product, but it actually wanted to connect. And I shouldn't pick on Sam. Sam turned out to be instrumental in publicizing this, as I'll explain in a minute. Here's what the data showed. By the way, as Mike said, and Sam, if you cannot model it in insurance, it does not exist. If you can't model it for these bond agencies, it doesn't exist. Anecdotal stories, things like that mean nothing. It is modeling that matters. It's not the only thing that matters, but the modeling mattered. So we had paid Guy Carpenter, to do this data, but I'm not taking it for granted, is what I'm saying. What this showed is, so these are return periods. You see the 10, 20, 50, and so on. This is like a 1 in 10-year storm, and then a 1 in 20-year storm, and a 1 in 50-year storm. What this shows is if a 1 in 10-year storm comes over the next 10 years, when we put on a roof, by the way, it's good for about 20 years, but what would happen, what would be the benefit to us of having these new roofs or better roofs if a 1 in 10-year storm came over the next 10 years? I'm not a mathematician, but that doesn't strike me like a risk. That strikes me like a certainty that you're going to get a 1 in 10-year storm in 10 years. So it doesn't seem like I was sticking my neck out into black swans or anything like that. It turns out, you see the dark green 5.8? We would not need to spend $5.8 million a year on reinsurance, which meant we would save $58 million over the next 10 years in reinsurance if we spent the money, the $50 million, up front to make the roofs better. And the reason is the same storm hits a more resilient book of business, more resilient homes, it will do less damage, which means that we don't trigger the reinsurance, which actually meant we didn't even need the top tranche altogether to get to a 1 in 100-year risk feature. We actually would rather invest our money in on-the-ground improvements to make us safer rather than just more reinsurance. And the light green, 9.2, just said, in addition, if a 1 in 10-year storm came through, there would be $9.2 million in losses that wouldn't happen because the same storm would hit these more resilient roofs, and it wouldn't break through. It wouldn't cause wind-driven rain to get in. It wouldn't ruin things inside. We would pay out less. The result was, for a $51 million expenditure, we would recoup $67 million over 10 years. If anything else happened, bonus. The savings only went up. So we suddenly had data that could link investments in resiliency to reinsurance savings. And the question was, in theory, this is what it showed. So we started doing things. And at this point, actually, let me just back up. You're not insurers, and I'm not a city or county official. But what I am going to talk about, this part is not so much the particular thing we did, but what it was like to care about, try to find a solution, even a small solution, to on-the-ground resiliency embedded in an organization, in this case, a straight insurance company, for which this was not a pressing concern. This isn't what they did. Institutionally, they would look at me as just a board member who's coming in, that they have to tolerate. The members of the board, which are largely insurers, at least half insurers, weren't sure how this is related to the standard underwriting and finance stuff that they always do. Why should we get into this business? We don't know anything about roofs and so on. This is just a story of what it was like to actually sweat the details to make this happen. You have to start with modeling. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient. There's a million details that have to be worked out, and frankly, that's where, just like people like us have to keep at it and work the problem from a million different sides. But it turned out to be way harder than just the model. So it turns out, for example, so we did this thing. I will say that armed with the model, in the end of 2016, at our board meeting in November 2016, I got the board to approve. You don't need to read this. It's this endorsement. We sent this out to all of our homeowners' policies on the Outer Banks for free. It said, we're adding something to your policy right now. It cost you nothing, but here it is. It's now part of your policy. What it says is, if anything comes and takes out your roof to the point where we have to replace it, under our underwriting standards, that's 51% damage to your roof. If your roof suffers 51% damage, you get a new roof. We don't try to patch it. If you suffer a major roof damage, of course we're going to come in and we're going to replace your roof. But when we do so, we'll put on one of these super roofs. Instead, no cost to you. We'll pick up the full cost of it, as long as we're going to do it, is what our deal was. I will tell you that the ink wasn't dried on this. This was November 10th, when I think by Thanksgiving, I got an email from Sam, who I'd never heard of, saying, I understand you have this graph from Guy Carpenter, that thing that I showed you. She said, please, can we see it? And honestly, I said, well, I have no problem with it. Guy Carpenter fought me. They said, no, we don't want this data going out, these data going out. I said, I'm sorry, this is my data. I paid for this. The solution we came is every time I show that data, I had to show you that little block of text. So I said, okay. So I went to the White House, we showed that little block of text, and we showed this to Sam. This was us going to the White House. This was like within a month. And we were re-invited back to the White House several times, and we were finally invited to the table. So Donald Trump's going to win the election somewhere at this point. Obama was in until January 20th, 2017. In that point, the Obama White House was wrapping up this insurance and catastrophe project that OMB and Sam were working on. And we found ourselves prominently highlighted as cutting edge. This was astonishing to us. It hadn't even gone into effect yet. We hadn't done one roof. I mean, this is a testimony to how pathetic the insurance industry is at this point. And the next day, I was invited to the World Bank to tell them about this huge innovation in insurance that to date had done nothing. So I will say that, well, I was happy to give these talks about, like I did with you, just talking about the concept. It turned out to be much harder. For example, I was really worried that the roofers that would do this wouldn't be like the technicians in that, the scientists. No offense to roofers, but I remember the roofers that put on my last roof. They didn't look like scientists to me. If I were to give them real specific extra things they had to do, how do I know they put in the right nails and the right pattern and whatever it required? It would require a huge amount of training. There also had to be a quality control mechanism known as evaluators to make sure that what we were getting in reality was safer on the ground, not just in theory. It turns out there were 0 evaluators in the state of North Carolina and 0 trained IBHS roofers. So while we were rolling this out, we trained everybody. We trained 300 evaluators and just picked up the tab to train them and get them ready. And we trained something like 100 or 200 roofing companies on how to do this. Then we waited. It went into effect in January. I mean, to be honest, this is being filmed, so this has nothing to do with the insurance entity, which prays every day that there's not a loss. Some of us on the mitigation side were really hoping there would be a loss so that we could see what it would be like to do an IBHS roof, to actually get on the learning curve. It turns out we did it in the winter because statistically we only lose 40, 43 roofs every winter. It's not a big season for us. But we were waiting. This was the first roof that, I can't remember what happened to this poor guy, like a tree fell on it or something. And the minute it happened, this poor guy, we swarmed on him. Like 20 cars came in. We wanted to supervise the roofers. Everyone was paying this attention to him. And we gave him this certificate, though. Honestly, from that point forward, it gave him 5, 6, 7% off his insurance premiums ever. That incentivizes nobody ahead of time, but was a nice bonus. The data indicate that one of these roofs sell on average for 7% more at resale for the house. That was just his to keep for nothing. And we were happy to do it. It turns out that going into last storm season, we had retrofitted 40-some roofs, 43. Then Florence hit. Florence was the biggest event in my company's history. We spent $1 billion. You remember that nice little swollen gray tranche with almost $2 billion on it? Well, goodbye. So we actually gave out $1.3 billion. We're the sort of insurance company you want to do business with. We are a nonprofit. We settled all Florence claims, all of them, within 60 days. The amount of lawsuits brought against us by all these policyholders is 0. I mean, our job is not to make money off you. Our job is, when you have a loss, to be there. Of course, we have underwriting standards and we have loss standards, but our job is to get people back. It turns out that 150 homes took advantage of that endorsement and built back better. That was interesting to me. We had thought there could be as many as 1,000 homes that qualified. One of the things I learned is a lot of people just said, we're not sure exactly how long extra it will take to do an IBHS roof. We just want back into our home. And the contractor is telling us, just sign us up now, we'll have you in next week. And a lot of people just didn't take advantage. That was just something we learned to sort of bank for next time. We go into this storm season, which started a few days ago, with this endorsement in place. My concern was that it's too slow. Well, a storm is too good of an opportunity to waste, not to build back better. I wanted to know, could we actually give money and bribe policyholders ahead of time, when there's no loss, to re-roof with one of these things? So last summer, I went on a little tour of any other insurance company that had tried one of these things, a grant program, to learn how to do it. And the board, to its credit, right in the middle of Florence, where we lost $1.3 billion, gave me $10 million to actually start an affirmative grant project where we will give $10 million right up front to see what it's like to administer such a program. This launched 32 days ago. It took a huge amount of effort. And for those of you that work in resiliency, all I could tell you is it's a great idea, but it took an enormous amount of time to make this work. There's a million things you have to be careful about not happening and are happening. It took forever to get our web page working just the way we wanted, but this launched perfectly. We are incredibly data hungry. We follow metrics on everything. This was like the first day that it opened, and we got something like 770 hits that day. We track how long the phone calls come. We track everything because we want to learn everything we can about people's appetite for risk and their roofs that they're willing to share with us so that we could make improvements going forward. These were some of the numbers. The bottom line at the bottom is we have approved 326 of these in the 1 month that this program has been in operation. We have another 400 in the wings. We can, in fact, fund 1,600 of these before we close the program in June. So we are still working on getting this happen. But the bottom line is it'll probably double, maybe triple the amount of roofs that we get by putting these things together. These are some of the first homes that have been granted. These aren't like mansions at the beach. These are regular homes by regular people, and it's just our pleasure to give them money because we make money when they make their roofs better. It was a win-win situation for everybody, and it just took a lot of time to make it happen. It's not exactly analogous to the sort of things you all have to do at the council level in working with bond agencies and the state and your constituencies, but it's also not dissimilar. You just have to sweat the details constantly. I'm going to go through this just to give you this thought. So Sam mentioned this thing about resilience bonds, and this is like the million-dollar financial question for the insurance industry. Is there a way, as Sam said, to create a financial product that will provide the financing up front to build the thing, whatever you're doing, or number of things you're doing, based on the projected savings in insurance over the next 10 or 20 years? That would be the sort of thing a resilience bond would be. You can do it. I can think of 2 or 3 ways you can do it outside of a financial product. Ours is just one of them. You could do it with builders and the NFIP CRS project by having them come in and do something that gets you huge CRS discounts and split the difference between your taxpayers and perhaps the money that would be freed up to go to a bond that would help pay for this to begin with. There's a million things to do where you're waiting for the reinsurance industry to figure this thing out. We didn't wait. I'll also point out that having regular insurance is, forget forget resilience bonds. You want to be sure that your insureds are covered as much as possible, especially by flood insurance, and do whatever it takes to make that happen because it bears on your credit risk. One of the things these agencies care about is how effective will be you looking forward and having taxpayers, let alone having taxpayers who are contributing and can pay for these things. To the extent they have insurance, they bounce back quicker, just regular insurance without getting fancy about it. Don't underestimate the importance of public funding. I understand that the pitch you've been getting is you're basically to try to buy insurance against government failure, like they're too slow in getting you things. And that's a worthwhile thing for you to think about these parametric products about. But long term, there are billions, and there's going to be billions of dollars of federal money in particular that's going to go to these projects. You just need to be completely up to speed on them. I myself have a pre-disaster mitigation grant into FEMA to help with this. And all I could tell you is, I'm with you. I know it hurts to work with FEMA. I'm a lawyer, and I find it impossible to work with these people. And yet, it's a real skill. And you need to be sure you have the people and the expertise to do it, because that's where hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars is going to come from. Sam said I might talk about the fact that you are all under the gun legally if you do something, and you can also be sued if you don't do things. I'm not. It's just too depressing. I'll just close with this. And I won't even make this appear, which is at bottom, it is all what I just think of as, and you do, is transaction engineering. You have to make these deals and these constituents come together in places where their interests overlap. It is important to recognize it and also to realize that it is much easier said than done. The prize goes to those of us that sweat it out and make it happen. And at least that's our story. Thank you.